now that we've learned about the discovery and the history of the discovery of cells, and then the structures within the cells and how cellular organisms get classified and organized, we're going to look at how cells transport materials into and out of their cells or across the plasma membrane in order to maintain homeostasis. So the plasma membrane moves substances into and out of the cell. We've pretty well established that. It controls everything that enters and leaves the cell. And it does this in two ways. The first is called passive transport, and the second way is called active transport. And so when we look at passive transport, this is the movement of a substance across the plasma membrane that does not require any additional energy. This is because substances are being moved from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. I always think of this as kind of like sledding down a hill. You start at the higher point and you slide down to the bottom, and it doesn't really wear you out. You don't have to spend any amount of energy. You just slide on down. So we're going from a high concentration to that low concentration. And concentration just refers to the number of particles in a substance per a given volume. So the more particles of a substance in that amount or in that volume gives you a higher concentration. And then substances will always move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So that's a little about passive transport in general. But there are three different types of passive transport that we're going to take a look at. The first of those is simple diffusion. This is a type of passive transport that does not require the help of transport proteins. The movement is due to a difference in concentration. In this, what happens is the substances will squeeze between those phospholipid molecules in the plasma membrane. These molecules have to be very small in order for this to happen. They also have to be hydrophobic because of the water-fearing tail portion. And so generally we could be talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. If we look at the diagram here, this extracellular space refers to this whole side of the diagram. And on the bottom we have intracellular, which is referring to this whole piece, or the bottom part. So if we look initially in the first time slot, the extracellular space, or the outside space, has a high concentration, and the intracellular has a low concentration. So that tells you right there that these particles are going to want to move into the cell. And so that brings us to this second little snapshot of time. And you can see that there are particles are in between the lipid molecules, and they are actually going into the intracellular space. So as that's happening, our concentration in the extracellular is decreasing, while the concentration in the intracellular area is increasing. So those particles are going to continue to move, brings us to this third chunk of time, and they're going to continue to move until they have reached an equilibrium. And equilibrium just refers to there being equal number of particles on both sides of the membrane. So that's simple diffusion, where the particles just squeeze between those lipid molecules, and they have to be small and hydrophobic in order for that to happen. Then a second type of passive transport is called osmosis, and this is the movement of water molecules. So again, they're going to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And the water is going to move into or out of the cell until its concentration is the same on both sides of the membrane. It's exactly the same as diffusion, but it's only talking about the movement of water molecules. So sometimes it might say the diffusion of water molecules. The third type of transport, passive transport, is facilitated diffusion. And this is where we use help of transport proteins to move molecules across the membrane. So transport proteins are proteins that form pores or holes in the membrane. And this allows water molecules and small ions to pass through the membrane without coming into contact with those hydrophobic tails. And so there are two types of transport proteins. We have channel proteins and carrier proteins. Channel proteins are proteins that form holes or a literal channel for those water molecules or small ions to pass through. So you can see here we actually have the channel being formed, and those molecules then can move on, and those proteins then provide a barrier from that hydrophobic region. Carrier proteins are proteins that bind with specific ions or molecules, and they'll change shape in order to carry that ion or molecule across the membrane. So this is kind of like a three-step process. The molecule or ion will enter in, and then the carrier protein will change shape, and then it will open on the inside of the cell or outside and release the molecule into or out of the cell. Active transport is our second type of transport, and this is a movement of a substance across the plasma membrane that requires energy. Substances are moving now from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. And so this would be like, instead of sledding down the hill, now we have to walk ourselves to the top of the hill. And that requires a lot more energy for us to do that. And so the energy molecule here, like usual, is ATP. Active transport often involves transport proteins. So one of those examples is the sodium-potassium pump. And this is a type of active transport in which sodium ions are pumped out of the cell and potassium ions are pumped into the cell. And we use carrier proteins to aid with that. And so I really recommend watching this video of this in action, and it brings it much more to life than just looking at the image here. But I'll try my best to explain it. So here, these orange molecules are sodium ions, and so they're going to enter that carrier protein. Then along will come a piece of energy, that ATP, and what you see here happening is the ATP giving some energy to that carrier protein, and that energy is enough to pop those sodium ions out of the cell. And as it opens, that carrier protein opens to the outside of the cell, these two potassium ions will enter the carrier protein, and then that signals the carrier protein to close, and it will open up on the inside of the cell. So it's an exchange of sodium ions for potassium ions, and it's active transport because we need this boost of energy in order to do this. A second type of active transport is called vesicle transport, and there are two types of vesicle transport. Vesicle transport is a type of active transport in which substances are carried across the cell membrane by vesicles. This would be one way that the Golgi apparatus gets proteins out of or to the outside of the cell. So our first type of vesicle transport is endocytosis, and this is a type of vesicle transport that moves substances into the cell. Remember the prefix endo means in. And so the plasma membrane will completely engulf the substance. That vesicle will pinch off from the membrane, and then that vesicle will carry the substance into the cell. We can have a couple different situations. One would be called phagocytosis, And that's when an entire cell gets engulfed. It pretty much eats itself. And then pinocytosis is when fluid is put into the vesicle. Exocytosis then, exo means to exit or out, is a type of vesicle transport that moves substances out of the cell. The vesicle containing the substance moves through the cytoplasm until it reaches the cell membrane. The vesicle will then fuse with the cell membrane and the substance is released outside of the cell. So here's a diagram of both of these. The first one is your exocytosis. You can see that there's a vesicle that's pinching off here. It has some particles in it. Then that vesicle moves towards the plasma membrane. And when it reaches the plasma membrane, it opens up on that outside, releasing the particles. And then this vesicle will actually become part of that plasma membrane. Endocytosis, the exact opposite happens. Whatever needs to come into the cell will attach to the plasma membrane. That plasma membrane pinches in, and eventually it will pinch in so that it closes off, and then the vesicle will now enter the cell. So all of these types of transport help the cell maintain homeostasis. And so cells need to maintain the right concentration of salts, nutrients, and other substances. Otherwise, the cell won't be able to function properly. So this requires constant adjustments of taking in salts, releasing salts, taking in nutrients, getting rid of wastes, and all of these conditions, because all of the conditions in a cell are constantly changing. So the ability to move substances into and out of the cell help a cell maintain homeostasis. It keeps the conditions within normal ranges within the cell and the living organisms.